Thank you very much. So is the microphone on? Yeah. So what I would like to do in this talk is to specifically speak about one of the central aspects of the Theosophical Society, universal brotherhood. It's perhaps also one of the most important aspects. And the way I would like to approach it is in relation to the theme of this conference on Theosophical history. So I will take a specific historical approach and try to answer the question, where did this idea actually come from? Why did it become important to the Theosophical Society? Where did they get it from? And have other groups used this idea? And why was it important for theosophists to implement this idea as a central part of the Theosophical Society?
Can I make a question while we wait?
Oh yeah.
What's your book about? The book that's about devotion. It's about the same topic.
Well, the one on I've written a book called The Academic Study of Western Esotericism, Part 1, which is basically about some of the developments which have led up to esotericism becoming an academic study at universities around the world. So because various scholars have since since the early 19th century, 20th century, studied various aspects which are often related to what we call esotericism, such as mysticism, for example, magic, Gnosticism, the Kabbalah, and so forth, which have been specific fields within the academia, but they have more or less come together in a study which are called Western Esotericism at Amsterdam, for example, and also at the University of Exeter earlier. And
so is it starting with like Favre and his stuff? Are you looking at?
Yeah, well, the second book, which hopefully soon will come out, takes off where Fev comes into the picture in 1992. So the first one is on developments prior to him and his formulation of Western Esotericism. But that's actually a quite different topic than the one which I will be speaking about here. I don't know why I rebooted.
Did you study anything Kendrick Clark then?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What was he like?
It was a true privilege, I would say. A solid historian. Yeah. Yeah.
Hit F5.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying hit F5 on the computer.
F5.
All the
Okay, so we're back. So universal brotherhood, and where did it come from? Well, I'm sure most of you know, if not all of you know, that the idea of a universal brotherhood of all mankind is one of the basic pillars of the Theosophical Society. The other two being the comparative study of world religions and philosophies and unexplained latent powers in man. Of course, these three pillars of the Theosophical Society were not all formulated at the beginning, but evolved through the 19th century into these specific points. In this talk, so I will first look at the history of the idea of universal brotherhood, then universal brotherhood as it was used and received in the early Theosophical Society, and then some further theosophical developments like the Point Loma Society in America. Well, taking the broad historical perspective, the idea of universal brotherhood has been known in many different philosophies and religions. Of course, it's not the same idea because it's used in different contexts and so forth, but it's not a foreign idea to religions and philosophies in general. If we, for example, go all the way back to ancient India, King Ashoka, he, after having waged quite a lot of wars, realized that perhaps the best path was to unite people instead of creating wars and bloodshed. So he founded an empire where the idea of brotherhood became very central, and we still have ancient pillars with engravings where we find the idea as important. In Buddhism in general, the ancient Sangha or monastic community also applied the idea in opposition to Hinduist society, which of course you know has the caste system, where there are these societal hierarchies for specific castes. And what the Buddhism did was to argue that everybody is welcome, no matter what sex you have, no matter what caste you belong to. Everyone is welcome in the Buddhist monastic community. So that was also an application of an idea of breaking down the various distinctions in society. Also, the ancient brother, so to speak, of Buddhism, Jainism, also cultivated the idea of brotherhood towards not only human beings but also towards animals as well, where they have, of course, have taken this to a general, perhaps extreme, with wearing masks, not to protect against insects and so forth, and the ideal of vegetarianism. In ancient Greece, we also find the idea among the Pythagoreans. They had the notion of universal friendship, which was a term they used. Stoicism as well in ancient times had the notion that everybody, all human beings have participate in the common logos, the common reason and intellect, which is common to all men, and in which all men are united, and also sought to establish societies where that principle was cultivated, that we are in essence united in logos. We also find the idea in ancient Christianity, especially with St. Paul, where, for example, one quote here, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." And this idea has been important also to Christianity for a long time, that in the body of Christ, or in the holy community, the church, there is a united brotherhood. Islam as well, when it developed, had a particular notion of Muslims and Islam as a universal brotherhood, which should extend around the globe. And the Sikh movement, which arose in the 15th century and onwards, was also an attempt to balance the presence of Islam and Hinduism in India at the time, taking a middle path and motivating universal brotherhood at that point. So that's just to give a broad historical perspective that, of course, the Theosophical Society is not the only movement in historical time which has found the idea important to human society in general. But to situate the Theosophical Society specifically within modern times as a modern religious phenomenon, a modern movement, we can look to around the formulation of Enlightenment ideals with major philosophers such as John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jacques Rousseau, and so forth, who all, of course, in distinction to religion and religious traditions, try to formulate ideals of a new society and a new world based on secular and rational ideals. But in that formulation, the idea of equality and universal human rights and so to speak, universal brotherhood became very central to that idea. We, for example, see these changes which these ideas provoked, formulated in the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776, which, among other things, states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So here we see societies on a larger scale being founded on the principle of equality, for example, which is a new ideal which continues to be cultivated not only up through the 19th century but still today. And it also resulted, of course, many of these ideas, which became quite influential, resulted in the French Revolution as well, with the slogan Liberté, Égalité and Fraternité, or liberty, equality and brotherhood as central. So on the larger contextual level, in which of course influenced movements like the Theosophical Society of the 19th century, we see these new ideals of brotherhood coming into play. Of course, the free Masonic society is also very much related to Enlightenment ideals and Enlightenment thinkers. And the idea of universal brotherhood was also central to Freemasonry in general. And Albert Mackey, who has written on the history of Freemasonry and so forth, he wrote in 1872 the following, where he specifically uses the notion of a universal brotherhood and constitutes it as one of the ideals of Freemasonry in general. He writes that when the day comes in which all men shall acknowledge one strong tie of brotherhood, then will be the true millennium. And it is a glorious thought that the mission of Masonry is to bring forth this consummation, to teach the doctrine of a universal brotherhood, and to enforce the necessity of man's giving a helping hand to man. So here the notion of universal brotherhood is very central to Freemasonry, which of course, as we already heard earlier today, was also important to Blavatsky and Theosophy and so forth. Generally, what happened during the historical period of the 19th century was that many of these very nice ideals of liberty and equality for all men, which were put into play in the 18th century, they did not always result in a complete transformation of society. And what of course happened during the period of industrialization, which really took force during the 19th century, was that when the middle class gained much more power and freedom in society, a whole new class came into play, or the so-called working class. And they were the ones who actually worked in all the new industrialized factories and so forth. And a lot of people, they began to question that and found that many of these very good Enlightenment ideals has actually resulted in a new class, and they have very poor conditions. And so perhaps the Enlightenment ideals were not as secure as we thought. So we have to consider the development of new ways of ordering society in order to counter the negative evolutions. And also there was the slave trade, of course, which even though there was a very nice universal brotherhood, Enlightenment ideals, the slave trade continued. It was first abolished in the United States, for example, after the Civil War in the early 1860s, and in Brazil as the latest in 1888. So questioning all these developments and lack of universal brotherhood, it actually led to the formulation of new thought systems, such as the rise of socialism and the formulation of communism, in order to counter the separations and distinctions and hierarchical constitutions of society at that point. And here we have Henri Saint-Simon on the top, and we have Karl Marx, who formulated two different versions of a way to counter what they saw as negative developments since the Enlightenment. And what is interesting in the development of socialism and communism is that a lot of people involved with alternative spiritualities and reform movements actually also were the same people who were involved in socialist movements, socialist groups, and new ways of new ways of living, and the formulation and writing of utopian literature and so forth. All ideas which look to the future, to a better society, which would ultimately reform the negative developments they saw around them during that time. Some of the people who were involved in these reform movements and who also were involved with modern spiritualism and socialism at the same time was someone like Elihu Burritt, an American blacksmith, pacifist, and peace advocate. He's perhaps not that well known to history, but he was very intellectual, autodidact person who is said to have been able to translate around 100 languages and got an honorary doctorate from Yale University and so forth. And he tried to create a lot of journals, and some of the journals he put into circulation was, for example, the Advocate of Peace and Universal Brotherhood. And there again you have the specific wording in 1876 of Universal Brotherhood. He also had a journal, The Bond of Brotherhood, and so forth. And in 1846 he created the League of Universal Brotherhood. So again, the same idea which we later see in the Theosophical Society were actually in the air, so to speak, during this period. So he was actually the founder of the first international peace movement against war, slavery, social injustice, solidarity between colors and classes. We have others who also emphasized during this period in the climate of reform movements, such as James Otis Wattles, a Yale graduate who fought for the abolitionist cause by freeing slaves and establishing schools. He also founded several significant societies, and for example, the Society for the Fraternal Brotherhood, which was a part of the Society for Universal Inquiry and Reform. He also, following the failure of his first society, he bought a place called Utopia, which had housed the socialist Fourierist community, which had to close due to lack of funds. But there he established a new society termed Universal Brotherhood, which only 1 year later was flooded due to the Great Ohio Flood. Another person who formulated ideas related to Universal Brotherhood and who also was deeply involved in the broader spectrum of spiritualism was Andrew Jackson Davis, who wrote quite a lot of works of a metaphysical, spiritual character. And he formulated something called the Great Law of Association, which basically was an idea pretty much in line with Plato's idea in the Republic that humanity consists of some people have some functions in society, other people have other functions, but when they all come together, they kind of constitute one body, which all needs its various limbs in order to function and work. And that was, in his view, how nature generally functions. Every part has to play its small part in order for the bigger harmony to function. And he also, in relation to this idea, founded a society he called the Harmonial Brotherhood to relate to this idea. So, in a way, that's the background in which the Theosophical Society was formed, even though, of course, the idea of Universal Brotherhood was not directly related or implemented as a principle during the founding of the society. The society, as you all know, was founded in the fall of 1875 in New York. But if we look at the specific texts, we have the first texts, such as the preamble and bylaws of the Theosophical Society. There is no direct mention of Universal Brotherhood as a principle in the founding of the society at that point. The only thing which has a similar tone to that is that in considering the qualities of applicants for membership, it knows neither race, sex, color, country, nor creed. But it does not speak about establishing a universal brotherhood among men. But of course it worked along what would at that point be quite progressive lines of including everyone. in the speech, inaugural speech Olcott did in order to inaugurate the society, likewise there is no direct mention of a universal brotherhood. It is, however, argued that since there is no mention of a universal brotherhood at this early stage in the history of the Theosophical Society, the idea only came into being, so to speak, in the Theosophical Society later, and that's not really true because Blavatsky actually spoke about the idea prior to the founding of the society. A few months prior, in July of 1875, Blavatsky wrote in her first occult article, A Few Questions to Hiraf. She wrote the following: "Spiritualism, the new world's conqueror, reviving like a fabulous phoenix out of the ashes of its first parent, occultism, will unite forever in one immortal brotherhood all antagonistic races, for this new Saint Michael will crush forever the dragon's head of death." Of course, if simply read outside of its historical context, this could sound like a praise of spiritualism or true spiritualism, occultism. But of course, we know that Blavatsky was quite involved in spiritualist milieus at the time. She knew quite a lot of spiritualists. She knew Andrew Jackson Davis, and she had been involved in spiritualist circles both in Cairo and in Paris, and also when she came to New York. And most of her first articles were actually in defense of spiritualism, even though she from the beginning, I would argue, had her own version of what spiritualism meant. So that means that even though she of course brought the idea up prior to the founding of the society, actually the idea had no real implementation in the society for a long time, or for at least until the move to India, I would argue. For example, if we take her great work, Isis Unveiled, from 1877, there's only one mention of the idea of universal brotherhood, and it's not her own mentioning of it. She quotes a very long paragraph from a letter from Charles Suffren, who we heard a little bit about earlier today, which states the following: Speculative masonry has much within its ranks to do. One is to accept women as a co-worker of man in the struggle of life. Another important thing is also to recognize practically the brotherhood of all humanity by refusing none on account of color, race, position, or creed. But again, Blavatsky does not discuss this part of her quote in Isis Unveiled. It's just a part of a longer quote, even though it's there. But of course, we know that Blavatsky was very a friend with Charles Suffren, who also was a co-founder of the society. And he also wrote to John Yarker, as we heard earlier today, and said that Blavatsky needed to be recognized as a serious Freemason because she has obviously great knowledge, which is revealed in Isis Unveiled, and they gave her this honorary degree. So there was a lot of interaction, and many Freemasons were a part of the early Theosophical Society, and until the early 1880s, they speculated and tried to implement Freemasonic structure within the society until it was finally abandoned. So the first historical documentation, so to speak, of the idea within Theosophical literature is in a small pamphlet or circular published the 3rd of May 1878, which states that the objects of the society are various, chiefly to aid in the institution of a brotherhood of humanity, wherein all good and pure men of every race shall recognize each other as the equal effects upon this planet of the uncreate, universal, infinite, and everlasting cause. So here in May 1878, that's the first mentioning in Theosophical literature, as far as I know, of the idea. But of course, if we look at Blavatsky's personal letters, we can see the idea beginning to emerge in late 1877. That's where she first begins to mention the idea, and that's because they come into contact with various people from India who they begin to correspond with. So that's my primary argument, that when they begin to correspond with the Arya Samaj in India, and also begin to become acquainted with the Buddhists of Sri Lanka, that's really where they begin to discuss this idea as important. And what also happened was that during the period 1878 in New York, there was actually not that much interest in Theosophy any longer, and things began to die out a little bit. So they speculated how to revive the Theosophical Society, and one strategy was, of course, to go and travel to India, not only to revive Theosophy as it was implemented in New York, but in order to also find the ancient wisdom which they believed to be located in India, and also to help in the cause against Christian missionaries among the Buddhists and among the Hindus. So this is just a timeline that, as we know, they changed headquarters to Bombay in May 1879, and they later changed headquarters to Adyar in 1882. So they had a friend, James Peoples, who had been in India, and he had observed public debates among Buddhist and Christian missionaries, and had recorded those debates. And Blavatsky and Alcott, they received a book Peoples had written, and were very fascinated about the argumentations and so forth. And they thought that they would travel to India to participate and help the Buddhists against the Christians. And one of the strategies they used in relation to that was the idea of universal brotherhood. They very much formulated that as the new central dimension of Theosophy, and the way to spread Theosophy in India. In relation to the spread of Theosophy in India, they of course took a more sympathetic approach, because they argued that India is an ancient, perhaps the most ancient culture, which has the embodiment of the most ancient wisdom. But the Christian missions had already been there for a long time. Traditionally, Christian missions in India stretch all the way back to St. Thomas, as tradition says, around 55 Common Era. And even though Christian missions has continued also since the development of Protestant churches, only around 2% of Indian population today is Catholic. So it has not been that effective as probably it was hoped. In the 19th century, several Hindu groups and Buddhist groups tried to counter Christian missions in India and avoid conversion, and instead tried to revive ancient Indian culture and scriptures and traditions and so forth. Among those, we find among the Hindus the Brahmo Samaj, established in 1830, and there is the Arya Samaj, established in 1875, and of course there's the Ramakrishna mission. And the people which Blavatsky and Alcott came into contact with were related to the Arya Samaj, and they actually found that they had a lot in common. That's at least what they thought. One of my colleagues in Copenhagen, he calls it a very unhappy love affair between the two societies. But at one point, for a couple of years, they actually merged and became one society. And Blavatsky and Alcott, of course, thought that Dayananda, the primary figure or guru of the Arya Samaja, he was a real Mahatma, a real adept. But they were soon disillusioned when they found out that he had a different agenda than they had, because he wanted to further traditional Hindu culture and religion in his new, perhaps modernized version, where they, of course, wanted to be open to all the various religious groups and include all those in a common universal truth or philosophy. And that's not the same ideal as Dayananda had. There were also on Sri Lanka, or Ceylon today, Buddhist Christians debates, and here we have someone like Sumangala, who we see here with Alcott, who became an important person for the spread and development of theosophy in Sri Lanka. And actually, what happened was that the Theosophical Society became quite influential in India and Sri Lanka at the time. And the way that they approached the Indians and the Buddhists and so forth at that point was quite effective, because they approached them with respect for their culture and with an attempt to revive their ancient traditions. Instead of converting them to a different system of thought. Some of their strategies were, for example, to take extensive travels around India, and they argumented for a non-dogma or no dogma approach. That means that you could be a member of the society even though you were a Hindu, or if you were Christian or Jaina or Zarathustrian or whatever, everybody was welcome in the Theosophical Society. And they also, which was quite in contrast to the Christians, they actually were initiated to become Buddhists in 1880. Alcott also helped design the Buddhist flag as we see it here. And they established schools, something which Annie Besant also later did. They established a major library in Adyar, and they published from 1879 The Theosophist, which also had the purpose of reviving ancient Indian scriptures and texts and literature and art and so forth. So by 1884, the Theosophical Society in India alone had grown to 100 Indian branches. So that's quite a contrast from where it was nearly dying out in New York in late 1877, and only a few years later it was quite evolved. Blavatsky also herself actually states that the society was reformulated, where the idea of universal brotherhood was put in the center. She writes here in 1889, when it was decided to reorganize the Theosophical Society upon the basis of a universal brotherhood of humanity, uniting men of all creeds in an effort to spread throughout the world the basic principles of a true religion, he, Sumangala, carefully gave his adhesion to the movement and accepted a place in the General Council, thus dignifying the society and securing it the goodwill of Buddhists the world over. So it proved a quite useful and effective strategy to be open to Buddhist beliefs and Hindu beliefs and so forth, because they all became a part of the philosophical milieu and the Theosophical Society around the world. The philosophical course, as I call it, well, Blavatsky argued, as I just showed, that the Theosophical Society was reorganized upon the principle of universal brotherhood. So from the late 1880s, perhaps, philosophies, they, in a way, had an agenda to establish a a global republic of conscience, as Blavatsky also calls it. And in a way, this system is very much in line with the whole climate of reform movements, from which also the idea of universal brotherhood came. And it was actually to establish a new world order, in a sense, built on the principle of universal brotherhood. But Blavatsky also argued it was not just a brotherhood of humanity, it was also an intellectual brotherhood. She very much hoped that Eastern ideas and Western ideas could merge into a new world religion. And this religion, or this philosophy, of course, should work against materialism, dogmatism, and hegemonic structures. She did not only criticize British rule in India, and she did not only criticize Christian missions, she also criticized traditional Hindu society and the caste system as upholding distinctions between people. So it was all structures which separated people. And this tied in with the year 1899, which was supposed also to be the end of a minor cycle in Kali Yuga, the great dark period. It was not the end, of course, of Kali Yuga, which will continue for a long time, but it was a minor cycle which would make it possible for a new spiritual inflow. So Blavatsky, perhaps not so much in her major works such as Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, she spoke very much about the idea of universal brotherhood in many of her articles and in the practical work, and made it a part of practical theosophy. And of course, as we all know, after her death, there was the first major schism in 1895 between the Adyar Society and the American Society. Because it's a long story to go into, but what actually happened was that two major societies emerged, and soon after the schism, William Judge, he unfortunately died, and a new leader came into play, Catherine Tingley, and she had some other ideas about how to govern and make the society prosperous at that time. Instead of having all the national lodges, the local lodges around the United States, she tried to bring all the resources to one focal point, which became Point Loma near San Diego in California, of which we have a picture here. And it was nearly a self-supported community where they produced quite a lot of goods and commerce and so forth. But what Catherine Tingley did, she found the idea of universal brotherhood also to be very central to theosophy, and she actually renamed the Theosophical Society. First, she founded the International Brotherhood League in 1897, and also the Universal Brotherhood Organization in 1898. And later, she merged the Theosophical Society with these groups, and it became known as the Universal Brotherhood and Theosophical Society. So, in a sense, in terms of words, so the Theosophical Society actually became secondary to the idea of universal brotherhood. And Besant also very much worked for the idea of universal brotherhood, especially in her work for Indian independence, which we see here as that she is quite recognized in India as a pioneer of independence, which can be seen as you could ask what is the motivation behind Annie Besant's work for Indian independence, and it would definitely be that the philosophical ideology of ancient India as the custodian of true wisdom, and also the philosophical idea of universal brotherhood are definitely behind her motivation for freeing freeing India and making it independent. So just to sum up, what I've tried to do in this talk is to look at the idea, the Brotherhood, because it's one of the central aspects of the Theosophical Society, and we could ask where did it actually come from. And as we saw, it was actually part not only of the larger climate of the Enlightenment period, but it was also a part of the spiritualist groups, part of Freemasonry and reform movements, all of which Blavatsky were involved in at that point. So it's not so surprising that she would take this idea and make it central to the Theosophical Society. And in terms of globalization, we could also argue that the idea of universal brotherhood was actually what made esotericism a global phenomenon, because it was the way the esotericism of Theosophy was implemented and spread around the globe, especially in India and so forth. So an idea such as universal brotherhood actually made esotericism flow into new directions during that period. Thank you so much.
Colin has a question.
Yes, an absolutely fascinating review of the whole historical process. But the one thing that I was waiting for didn't come.
Yeah.
And that was where did this idea of a nucleus of universal brotherhood step into the picture? Because the nucleus idea has caused us a lot of trouble here and there over charitable status and so on.
Yeah. But what particularly do you mean by nucleus?
Well, that's the big question.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, because Blavatsky, she in one place states that it's all pure hearts and minds who would come together in not only in a brotherhood of humanity, but also in an intellectual brotherhood. So the question is, of course, is that related to the idea of the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society? Because the esoteric section was partly established for members who wanted to practically live the ideals of Theosophy, and not just being a member, but actually live it. As we saw here in London, for example, during the last years of Blavatsky's life. So at one place, from one perspective, that might actually be what she had in mind, that the nucleus was, a kind of elite group who would lead this on. And but it's a good question, yeah. But you could also argue that a nucleus, of course, is all the different races and religions coming together. But the idea of universal brotherhood definitely ties in with the idea of one universal religion, because it is the breaking down of distinctions between men, and systems of thought also which uphold distinctions between men. Yeah.
It was just so strange that it got embodied in the first object as we now have it.
Yeah.
You can understand it as part of the overall background philosophy, but for it actually to become part of the words of the first object was really quite dramatic, and one wonders where it came in the late 19th century or after.
That's what the specific wording. Yeah, that would be interesting to look into the specific wording. Yeah.
There's a question over there, and then Janet.
I was going to ask you, sort of, tying in with the idea of universal brotherhood.
Yeah.
What would you say is the relationship between Theosophy and 20th century sort of political ideologies? And I appreciate the fact that Theosophy is never, well, it hasn't particularly tied itself to ideology and sort of, with the possible exception of the Indian National Congress, which it has obviously quite a close historic relationship with.
Yeah.
But during the 20th century, what was like its relationship to, movements like, because obviously we sort of see the rise of communism and fascism and socialism, and all these different sort of isms.
Yeah.
And so, how does Theosophy have a relationship to that? I mean, are there I mean, I know that there are a lot of philosophers, for example, who are in the Labour Party. Like my friend over here, he said that most of all the politicians in Britain who've been philosophers have been members of the Labour Party. So I was just wondering what your understanding of that was.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a very complex question because from one point of view, the official philosophical line has been to not be political. And Blavatsky also writes that she dislikes the socialists and she dislikes the communists, and she didn't want to have anything to do with politics. But still, all the people, many of the most charismatic and pioneering people of the Theosophical Society were somehow involved in politics. We know the story about India, but also there's a recent book they're called the Vanguard of the New Age, which studies the Canadian Theosophical Society from early 20th century up through the Second World War, and it really shows that most of the people who were central in the Theosophical Society very much were related to socialism, and were active party members and so forth. And I also know Marco has studied quite a lot about philosophy and politics in Italy as well, and how they actually were involved in various political parties.
Well, in Italy the situation is complicated because in the interwar period there was the fascist regime, and that meant that the Theosophical Society, if it wanted to stay as a public movement, had to negotiate with the regime in one way or another. Also, the regime itself, in one period, was also extremely popular. It was not just something that was imposed from above. So there were indeed members of the Italian section of the Theosophical Society that were fascists. They were even members of the party.
In order to adapt to the situation as well.
Yes. And in fact, I have found articles that were not published necessarily in Italy, but also in international journals of the Theosophical Society, which tended to see a possibility of a dialogue between theosophy and fascism.
Yeah.
So today this may seem a bit strange, but in fact one has to look back at what was the context then. And in fact, there were many people here in England who saw Mussolini as a nice guy. So someone who would fight against communism, which was seen as a much serious threat actually to democracy and to...
exactly.
So, and then of course things changed in the late 30s because the leadership at the time, the international leadership, decided that enough was enough, and then there was a clear policy saying that fascism was incompatible with theosophy. Yeah. But this put Italian theosophy in a very bad position, because at that moment it was clear that no compromise could be possible anymore, and so they had to go to clandestinity, and the regime crushed them down from one day to the other.
But it was legal.
Can I just bring in Janet, because Janet and then Kevin had their hand up, and then I think you as well. So we're running out of time. If we've got time, Janet.
It was just a very quick comment because I thought it was a brilliant talk actually.
Thank you.
You mentioned the breakdown of distinctions, and I was also going to just comment that, of course, paradoxically, it seems to me that the TS actually then celebrated distinctions really, because it brought these ancient cultures almost back to life. So it did bring back our problems we did. So in a sense, it's two things, isn't it?
It is, that's true. While they on the one hand try to find similarities which would constitute universal truths in a way, they also respected the various traditions in themselves and translated texts, revived ancient forms of thought and so forth. So there are both sides. But there has also been some who argue that the structure of the Theosophical Society, of course, interpret these traditions in a particular manner, which in a way takes them out of the original context as well. So, yeah.
Kevin,
Just a brief continuation of my comment on India. The conference earlier, I was much later on at a conference in 1993 in India and entered into conversation with someone who was very active in human rights work, particularly for Dalit rights in India. I mentioned I was going from Bangalore where to Adyar, and he said, "What? Adyar, the TS? Why are you going there?" And he said, "That's nothing to do with Brotherhood and human rights. It's all a Brahmin plot, as it were." But he pointed out that the only Hindu presidents, which were Sri Ram and his daughter Radha Bernie, they are past presidents, who were both Brahmins, I mean the same family. All the only other Asian, Janardasa was Buddhist. All the rest have been Europeans. Our new president, of course, is an American. But to counter that, interestingly, from another source at Adyar, not resulted, but also said is that why were Dalits, apart from in menial tasks, not more fully employed in the administration of the Theosophical Society in India? And apparently, rather than his comment, it's got nothing to do with caste; it's to do with competence, which is often an excuse for that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
right, there's one here, and then we've got so many hands up. I thought we had till 1:15. Thought we were, yes. All right, yes, the gentleman.
Okay, so just very shortly, continuation, I think a very interesting chapter to investigate is the question of Theosophical Society and its reaction to Nazism.
Yeah.
And as far I looked a little bit into it, so as the Adyar establishment at the time, the leadership was from the beginning, from 1933, very much against it. There were a few German theosophists who tried to somehow
to adapt,
negotiate and adapt. And actually, the guy that stood at the head was Verweyen. And I don't know if ironically is the right word, but in the end he died in Bergen-Belsen in a concentration camp. But he tried to advocate some kind of, and actually he used, by the way, when he was attacked for defending Hitler, he said, hey, we're not political. Why are you bringing me political issues here? So,
thank you. Yeah.
We did have one here, and I think then that'll have to be the last one.
No, because it was new to me that it seems that the idea of Universal Brotherhood was not the beginning of the foundation of the society, a very strong presence, but then it became stronger towards Blavatsky's end, of the end of her life. And it was something that I was wondering all the time, not sure if you investigated that or not, maybe something that can be done, is whether the idea of the Universal Brotherhood was clear and strong in the Mahatma letters, because they were happening in the same time at the beginning of the society. Because I don't know if you because to me it was something, what are the Mahatma letters? Weren't these ideas strong there?
Yeah. I've looked into that actually. Well, as I argued, the idea of Universal Brotherhood comes into play late 1877, and it's really a part of the move to India. And the Mahatma letters, of course, begin to come forth to AP Synod and AU Hume, 1880, 1881. And the Universal Brotherhood is an important factor in the Mahatma letters. It's used as an argument to Synod and Hume. They always want to learn more about occultism, and they want to learn how to produce occult phenomena and all these things. But the Mahatmas often tell them in the letters, no, the most important thing is Universal Brotherhood. That's really what you have to learn. So the idea as a discourse begins to emerge there as a primary force of discourse in the Theosophical Society, and it comes through the authority of the Mahatmas as well to the new disciples, Synod and Hume. So it's a strong part of the Mahatma letters. Yeah.
Right, I'm very sorry. There are a number of hands up, and maybe you can speak to 10 in the break. Sorry. You've stimulated a lot of very interesting questions.
Thank you.
Obviously, everyone really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
It was really excellent, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now have